Hey friends, and welcome to this week's episode of the U-Turn Podcast. This is your host, Ashley Stahl. I'm a counterterrorism professional turned career coach, speaker, and Forbes blogger, and I created the U-Turn Podcast because, let's face it, every now and again we realize that we're living life on autopilot and it's time to wake up and make that U-turn in your life. So prepare to go deep with some of the most transformational people I know, here to help you grow and upgrade your mindset, whether it's in work or love. Also, be sure to stick around for the end of every episode where I'm going to reflect on the conversation and offer actionable coaching insights to have a real impact on your life. In the meantime, we've opened up access to 3 free e-courses on uturnpodcast.com. So head on over there if you want to land a new job you love, find your purpose, or launch your dream business. All of these courses are totally free. All you got to do is head on over to uturnpodcast.com. That's YOUTURN podcast.com. Now let's get started with this week's guest.
And it can also happen with neglect, where if we have a deprivation of physical touch, we can grow up as very needy, very greedy for affection, and put ourselves in situations where we embrace love from people that are absolutely toxic and horrible for us. Mm-hmm. So when we kind of start to break down, okay, were my physical boundaries abused or were they neglected, and start to make sense and connect those dots and make sense of our story, we start to make new choices so we can be more mindful of where our come from is.
Hey everybody, it's Ash here, and I am on the U-Turn Podcast this week with Silvy Khoucasian. She is a relationship coach, a therapist focused on boundaries, attachment styles, all the things that you guys know I love to talk about and I think are so fundamental to the core of our being in our everyday lives and our relationships. And let's face it, if you are not feeling good in your heart and your relationships, whether you're dating, whether you're in a relationship, whether you're married, whatever have you, usually it trickles into your day because it's painful. And that is why I figured who better to have here than Silvy to talk about how your boundaries can get violated, specifically 4 ways that they can. And before we jump into all of that, Silvy, thank you so much for making the time on your calendar to be here.
I'm so excited and honored to be here, Ashley. Can't even tell you that enough.
Yeah, you too. It's so interesting because I do a lot of these interviews and I notice that sometimes I get tired before some of them, even though they're great interviews. And I've been really looking forward to this and feeling energized at the thought of hearing whatever you have to say. So thank you. Yeah. Well, so what is it that got you into this? Because it sounds like, like most people, I think their pain becomes their message. And so I'm always curious what got you into coaching and therapy.
It's the $1 million question. Of course, we have to start with that, right? Yeah. So as a therapist, as somebody that has been pretty focused on being able to really see and understand other people's pain, of course, there's always a dark side, So for me, I was really good at doing that. I was really good at helping other people, being, inspiring them with what was going on for them. But I spent so much of my life doing it at the cost of myself and not even realizing I was doing it at the cost of myself. And it was showing up in very codependent ways, not just in my relationships with my intimate partners, but even with my close friends. So I would sacrifice so much of me, and then when I wouldn't get the same thing back, I would end up feeling so resentful, and I just didn't understand why. And so it became my mission to figure out, okay, how can I still, maintain this sense of giving and loving the people that I care about, but also do it in a way that is not neglecting of me and my own needs, and speaking up for what it is that's important for me as well. So that's how my journey collided with, really wanting to help people with boundaries.
And what do you think it is that keeps people from connecting to themselves enough to realize when they've gone past that point of no return? You know what I mean? Because I feel like, for example, everybody on U-Turn podcasts, I think sometimes I'm not registering how many people might be listening because I just talk about my life as if I'm talking to my mom. But like for me, my journey was with debt. So like losing my first company, going $500,000 into debt, being too stubborn to claim bankruptcy and paying it off. And what I realized about the debt looking back is that there's a level of denial of myself, of what's happening for me to get into that much debt, right? Like when things weren't working in my business, I was like, maybe it's going to work now. Maybe it's going to work now. And there's like that fine line between hoping and denial. And I think that for me, $100,000, maybe that's a certain level of denial, but to get to 500,000, it was like so much denial and not connecting to myself. And I think that's kind of a reference for people with their own boundaries where like they don't really realize when their gas tank is like running low until it's empty. And so I'm curious to understand like what's going on there when you feel like all these years of your life, it was more difficult for you to realize that, because I've always been like the boundary queen over the years. And my friends come to me for this. So I'm curious to hear from you what you're seeing.
Well, you hit something really powerful, which is the common thread when people finally figure out, oh my God, I need to have boundaries around myself or my relationships or what I'm going through. And it's that piece about, it usually takes some kind of wake-up call or a breakup or an incident of cheating or hitting something that's so deeply wounding, that's, that rock bottom feeling that alerts us, okay, that there's a danger, there's something that is really essential that we need to look at. Because the reality is, if we've been like a tea bag those boundaries have been violated and we've been dunked into that experience, we can't see that we're violating it. So, for example, my family, we immigrated to the United States when I was 4 years old from Syria and Saudi Arabia. And we were all about survival. My parents left their entire support system. They left everything to, get me and my sister a fresh opportunity to be able to have the potential to live, healthy and productive and meaningful lives. But of course, everything has a cost. They had to give up, we had to lose a lot of that emotional connection and ability to emotionally regulate, because there was so much of, okay, let's get food on the table. Let's make sure that the kids are in school, and let's make sure that we just have the essentials. And in the culture that I grew up with, when we're in that survival mindset, a lot of things get neglected. And, again, I say this, my parents did the best they could, and I adore them. And one of the things that I struggled with, I was an extremely sensitive child. I identify as a highly sensitive person, HSP. Mm-hmm. And so it's really hard when you're in that survival mindset for your parents to really get those kind of needs. And so for me, the biggest boundary for me that I didn't realize how much I needed was that emotional comfort.
And I actually love that you brought up HSP, because I've not heard anybody on the U-Turn podcast bring that up, but I have friends who identify as that. Can you explain a little bit about what does it mean to be a highly sensitive person? Because I think there's a lot of people that don't realize that this is something for them, and maybe there's some reading that they can do.
Sure. And there's definitely, it's a spectrum. There's varying degrees of it, but highly sensitive people tend to get very stimulated very quickly. They get overwhelmed very fast. So, let's say somebody's venting to them about something, and if they're not in the good space, they can, maybe shut down, or just they can't take a lot of stimulation. I need a lot of alone time. I need to process by myself. I can't do a lot of social things because I get very, very overwhelmed. And for me, it's more the emotional content that can overwhelm me. So I've had to really learn to expand my window of tolerance, but also really honoring where my limits are as part of the healing for that, so it does grow. And, sensitive people can build their tolerance, but a big part of what helps to heal it is to honor the limit of where you are and nurturing that space before you can, stretch that. So it's just being really aware that there's nothing wrong with you. It's just you tend to, you tend to be attuned to things on a much deeper level than most people, and it's essential that we take care of that for ourselves in order to function. It's not even just want to. It's like you will not function if you don't.
And I know that you work on attachment styles. Like before we even get into boundaries, I'm so curious like I myself, so I have been in secure relationships and I've had a very secure attachment, and then I've also waffled in anxious attachment. So those of you who haven't listened to any of the episodes on attachment styles, like I know we did an episode with Nora DeKaiser. She talks about it. It's a great one to tune into as well. But I would love
to listen to that one, by the way, and it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, she was great. And I'm so curious. I know that you have so much to say about this. Like for everybody listening, like what is your kind of like just take on the 4 attachment styles for everyone who maybe didn't listen to that episode or they're taking some notes now?
Oh man, the attachment styles is the meat and potatoes of my work. So when we're in therapy school, we're trained in so many different lenses, whether it's solution focused or how our social constructs shape the way we see the world. For me, what was the one that struck the biggest chord was the attachment styles, meaning how we bond and connect and attach to our primary caregiver, which is our mother or our father or an uncle, but whoever was the person that was in charge of emotionally regulating us, that dynamic gets recreated in adulthood. And so, of course, who we are in a relationship with affects us. This is all on a spectrum. But if we had more of an inconsistent emotional response from a parent, we tend to be more anxious. If we had a parent that was not tuned in to us emotionally at all, or overbearingly tuned to us, we will either be dismissive or fearful avoidant. And if we had a parent that was available and really made repairs quickly and was able to just get a sense of what our needs were fairly often, then we tend to be more securely attached, which is what we want to move towards and what we can move towards if we create healthy boundaries and agreements in our adult relationships.
I love how, you were able to so clearly just explain right there the tie between attachment styles and boundaries, because I think sometimes people think, there's this school of thought talking about attachments and then there's boundaries as a separate thing, but really boundaries are in the healing of the attachments, which is so beautiful to see. And you were saying that there's 4 ways your boundaries get violated before we started talking or recording. And those of you listening, I know you take notes. So she was saying it's emotional, spiritual, intellectual, and physical are the ones that I wrote down. And I'm so curious, Silvy, to hear what each one looks like and what the healing opportunity is. So for everybody listening, like what does it look like if your emotional boundaries are violated in your upbringing or even right now in your life?
Got it. And I want to say, learning about these was a game changer for me and really helped to validate why we are so, like you said, in denial about our boundaries, but also what we can do about it instead. And I want to give credit to the person that created these boundaries, and her name is Raquel Lerner, and she really specializes with identifying how to understand how each of these has been laid out. So I'll dive into the emotional one, which is the one that you began with. And so there's a few different ways our emotional boundaries get violated. One of it, of course, is, not having our emotions validated. That's kind of like a no-brainer, right? If our emotions were dismissed or not made to be important or invalidated, we're going to tend to not prioritize or stand up for our emotions if somebody is, not prioritizing them as an adult. We're just kind of like, oh, this is normal, even though it kind of feels weird that you're doing this, but this is so familiar that I don't really even realize something is happening that's wrong. So some other ways is, let's say your parent relied on you a lot for emotional comfort as a child. If parents get divorced, a lot of times you'll see one parent making their child the surrogate partner. So they'll vent to that child, or they'll do a lot of their grieving with, while they're holding that child. And that child cannot tolerate such an intense experience. So what happens is, part of them has to shut off internally within themselves. And they start to get very disconnected from their own experience. So notice they're being present for and tuning into now their parents' experience. But what that's costing them is being available and having somebody to mirror and be present for theirs. So that's huge. And that's something that's fairly common. We also call that the parentified child in therapy. Some other ways the emotional boundaries can get violated is if parents tell inappropriate secrets to their kids, or if they start talking about sexuality to their kids when they're not age appropriate, or they're not giving context. They might just make a few sexual comments and the child's left wondering what the hell, doesn't feel appropriate. And kids are smart. They can feel when something is off, and when things aren't broken down in context, it just feels extremely violating for a child. Some other ways is if nobody in the family feels their feelings, but the child ends up being the sponge. So they end up taking all the emotionality that nobody else in the family is willing to feel. These people choose partners as adults that either are completely shut down and they end up feeling everything for them, or flip side, somebody that is extremely emotional and it just becomes a very unhealthy and unbalanced dynamic.
Okay, so like somebody who growing up, their emotional boundaries tended to get crossed, whether that was like heavy reliance from a parent or comments that didn't really get explained for full processing or things that weren't age appropriate, you would say that they tend to pick partners that are emotionally shut off or are overly emotional. Is that what you were saying just now?
So for the last piece, when the parents are not, or the family is not able to feel their emotions, that's when we more often pick somebody that is either extremely shut down or very emotional. For the other stuff, that's more, we just won't be aware of our own feelings, and we might actually neglect our own as a way to just be present for somebody else, which is just a pattern. It's not something we want, but we've been trained to take on that kind of role.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, obviously this one's like resonating for me because everybody listening has heard me talk about how like my dad went through a lot when I was a kid, and he's like the light of the room to this day. Like, and he always has been, but he's also like the dark cloud in the room, not because he's an angry person, because when he's sad, everybody can feel it because he's such a light. And when he was sad as a kid, I definitely felt it. He went through a lot, and I felt like he would vent about it and I would catch that. And so I think for me, it was an emotional boundary where like I felt a lot and I learned to check out. And I'm curious for anybody who had this experience, like what that trauma could do for them, because what I'm noticing now as an adult is that when I feel like something is emotionally too much for me, I have like a physical response, like my eyes glaze over, I get really sleepy, I start to yawn. Like these are things that I think a lot of people who maybe haven't gone to therapy or even have, they don't realize their body is showing them that there's trauma there too. Is there any kind of info you can give anyone listening around like maybe how they might start to physically operate when one of these boundaries are crossed?
Absolutely. And I love that you mentioned the physical boundary, because I definitely can see, we can get very sleepy, or especially if we feel shame about something that we've been told, again, like if we've been given inappropriate secrets, like that feels uncomfortable and almost brings up a lot of shame for the child. So anything that triggers those kind of things that haven't been dealt with as an adult, absolutely. Shame is, sleepiness and tiredness is one of the defenses against shame. So if we haven't been regulated in that emotion, we can check out, kind of numb out, or, get really sleepy. Definitely for me, one of the ways I process, I sleep, I nap, I need to nap. It's the only thing I can do when I'm really on emotional overwhelm. And I used to sleep like a bear. Now I'm like, okay, as I process things, it's a little bit easier. The fearful avoidant attachment style, I know this is kind of linking across, so I'm hoping this makes sense. And please, Ashley, let me know if I'm not, so I can clarify. People that are avoidantly fearfully attached, they often felt the experience of being very used. So this can kind of intersect with the emotional boundaries being violated. So they felt used for helping somebody else, but at the cost of themselves. So a lot of times when I work with people that are avoidantly fearful, they're afraid of being in relationships. And even though on the surface, they might be dating and they might appear like they're trying, there's intuitively some awareness that like, okay, wow, I know that as I enter a relationship with somebody, there's some stuff that's going to come up that I'm really terrified of having to feel and experience. So they kind of sabotage themselves because it's really hard. It's one of those experiences. In order to actually get past that first stage of a relationship, you have to feel all of those feelings that were neglected and you didn't have access to, or nobody was able to help you regulate as a child. Can you imagine like how hard that is to without having somebody, be present for your painful experience?
Okay, so kind of just giving everyone an overview. So I remember like the basic attachments that I learned was secure, which like you had mentioned, everybody's kind of aiming for that one, right? Like it feels fun to be secure. And then And then there's anxious, which most people are very preoccupied by love and worried about losing someone. That's generally what I think of when I think of anxious. Is there something that you think of when you think of anxious?
You said it. They're pretty much they're constantly wanting to stay connected to their partner, and they'll do all kinds of things and even act out just to create that
attachment
bond with a person. Yeah.
And then I learned avoidant, but I didn't really learn about fearful avoidant. So is there like two different types of avoidant attachment?
Yes.
Okay.
So there's two types and they're very different. They're similar in the way that so fearful avoidant and dismissive avoidant, they both shut down when they're under stress. They both go internal. They tend to dismiss their own needs because their needs were not prioritized as kids. And what happens for fearful avoidant is they felt the experience of being used often, whether they were the performer child that had to kind of, perform for the family, or again, like I said, maybe their emotional boundaries were violated and had to comfort the parent, but they were left having nobody to tend to them. So somebody that was used in that way tends to be more fearful avoidant, and they actually they still crave relationships more than the dismissive avoidant, but they have a lot of interpersonal anxiety when they're in a relationship with someone, again, because it triggers all of those feelings of being used in that kind of one-dimensional relationship. It was not for them, it was for the other person.
Okay, so that's the fearful avoidant, is like the
That's
person
fearful.
with the parent that like maybe vented too much or shared too much. And then what about the dismissive avoidant person? What do they look like?
So the dismissive avoidant is somebody that was left alone a lot more. So this is somebody that was not really engaged with much at all as a child, whether that's, intellectually or emotionally. And so as an adult, they're like the CEO of the company. They're so self-sufficient. They can run shit like there's no tomorrow, but they just don't know how to do relationship well. They don't, if their partner has needs, they don't want to take care of them. And even if, they don't have that same kind of interpersonal anxiety, they can just kind of shut that off. So usually they're the ones that, unless they're really acknowledging and wanting to see their unhealthy behaviors, they're the ones that just can cut off from relationships fairly quickly and just kind of move on to another relationship and repeat the same pattern over and over again.
So would you say that people who are narcissists tend to be dismissive avoidant in the first place?
There's definitely a lot of crossover with the similar dismissive attachment and narcissistic behaviors. Because again, I never like to say anything is an exact fit. Yeah. There's so much of a spectrum, but there's a lot of crossover for the dismissive avoidant and narcissistic. Well, in that they don't feel that anxiety or, that desire to be able to be present for their partner's needs unless they've done a lot of deep healing and work on owning their own needs.
Well, you know me, I'm always like, well, how can I put everything into a box so that we can all just feel organized?
I love that. No, I'm all about the boxes.
It's a little bit messy. That's good. It's good that you're a therapist and you're like, all right, Ashley. So, okay. So anybody listening right now, if somebody over relied on you, but you still crave relationship, or you feel a tendency to still thrive in it, it's more fearful avoidant. Whereas somebody who, maybe they were on their own a lot, they're more dismissive avoidant, and they don't necessarily feel like it's first nature for them to do well in relationship unless they do a lot of healing, is what I kind of took out of it. And just thinking about emotional boundaries, what emotional boundary was crossed for somebody who maybe was left alone as a kid a lot? Is that a boundary that they got crossed, or was it something else?
Well, that's more of yes. So that would be more of a neglect. So like if somebody was neglected, they just were not tended to. So internally, they had, in order to cope with that overwhelming feeling of being left alone, they had to shut down. So it's almost like, whereas the fearful avoidant still has access to those feelings, it still allows themselves to get more attached. And because they still had the connection, even though it was more one directional, the dismissive avoidant just tends to minimize. Like they just tend to minimize the importance of relationships in general. Oh, it's not a big deal, even though the deep down truth is that they want it. So they don't have the ability to really see how important it is to them until usually there's a rock bottom experience where they hit some of that humanity in themselves and they actually get in touch with all of those feelings of neglect.
So interesting. Okay. So spiritual boundaries being violated. I think I'm so curious to hear what you say about this. I feel like this is happening all the time. So what does that look like when you were a kid or even right now in your life if your spiritual boundaries are being crossed?
This is probably the one that I want to go on top of the roof and scream and shout to help people, because like you're right, it happens all the time. It's happening right now all over the world. And yes, this is definitely something that I feel very, very passionate about. So, there's a couple of different ways that our spiritual boundaries get violated. And our spirituality, our sense of connection to a higher power, whether that's God or source or whatever we label it, is the most profound experience we can have, and it's so intimate and it's so personally unique. And so when that is abused and it's used in a way to manipulate and bring fear, it can violate our sense of connection to that experience. So whether that's using the fear of God, using punishment, using threatening that God will see this if you make a mistake, or how coaches use spiritual bypassing.
Yes.
And they don't allow the person to feel sad. Get to the enlightenment stage before you actually get to be a human. And that is one of the most damaging and traumatizing experiences that we can do to another human being.
This makes me think a lot for anybody in like practical use around spiritual boundaries, and you can correct me here because I'm not sure if I have it accurate, but my sense is that a lot of people don't validate other people in communication. So those of you listening, validation, what is it? So my take on it is, if you say I'm sad, maybe the person disagrees and thinks like there's nothing to be sad about, but they can still at least appreciate or validate the fact that it's okay that you're sad, or just acknowledge that you're having your experience. So what that has looked like in my friendships is like, I'm upset, and somebody saying like, it's okay that you're upset, or like, I get that you're upset, or I hear you. And I can see how damaging it is. I think a lot of the times when we grow up in families, somebody might say, I'm working so hard and I'm so tired. And a lot of families might say something like, but look how hard everybody else is working. So there's not a lot of validation for somebody versus saying something like, oh, I'm so sorry that you're tired and that you're working so hard. Is there anything I can do? Or even just, I hear you, A lot of people tend to meet each other and say, but look at this, or but what about that? And it just completely casts a shadow on somebody's truth and like the experience of where they are. So I'm curious, what other indicators in communication are you seeing? Like, I know that like there's an infection right now in the personal development industry where it's like, be positive. It's like, you need to cry your eyes out in order to get there sometimes.
Absolutely. You can't get there without crying your eyes out all the time. You know what I mean? Most of the time.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. And I remember seeing a post that you did on your Instagram, Ashley, where you actually taught people how to validate. And I was like, I love this woman. She gets it. I was like, because yes, that validation is the connection. Without that, we don't have a relationship. We're literally just using each other for our own self-serving and our own agendas, which happens so much, So I did one of those seminar experiences where you're enrolling. Have you heard of those, kind of like those MIT kind of things?
Yeah.
Which I'm a huge fan of. All those, they have an amazing intention. But I think what starts to happen in these group thing experiences is that the mission, the purpose of the whole thing, and making sure that it gets to that end result gets prioritized over the individuals in that experience. And so much of the details and nuances and the humanness gets bypassed in order to get to that end result. So we have to be really, really careful whenever we're participating in any kind of group or, religious or, any kind of group experience or coaching experience that doesn't make room for individuality and differences of opinions and differences in emotional capacities and honoring people's limits. I mean, I could go on and on because I was personally traumatized doing an experience like that. And it took me a lot of therapy to heal and recover from that. And so I want to protect as many people as I can. And of course, everything's, we learn from everything, right? So it's like we have to all go through our learning and make our own mistakes and kind of finally get to see what boundaries are important for us. But we can do it with guidance and with boundaries.
I love the topic of spiritual bypassing since we're just talking about this. And I love the idea of like, how can we give everybody listening right now the words that they might be saying that is a spiritual bypass, so that we can show them when they're crossing their own spiritual boundaries or violating their own spiritual boundaries that they're not realizing. Like, for example, I have friends that are like miserably married, and they're like, but it's our souls are supposed to do this. Or I just had gotten off a conversation with Lori Harder on the U-Turn podcast, and we were talking about how we're seeing a lot of spiritual bypassing of people in the personal development world who are saying they're canceling and being flaky because their body is tired and they need to honor themselves, which is a very good thing, but also kind of tips into like they don't show up for their commitments and they see everything as optional, even though they said yes. So I'm curious, like, how can we support everybody listening, or what's your take on things that people might be saying where they're kind of like spiritual bypassing and they don't realize it?
Well, actually, do you mean like spiritually bypassing ourselves or other people? Just for me to clarify.
I think keeping themselves in situations that might not work for them, and using spiritual language to stay there, like not having boundaries with themselves.
Got it. Yes. And that's the biggest piece of all is it all comes down to if somebody outside of us is creating an experience that's harmful, that's one thing. And of course that's valid, but where we have power is taking that time to identify if this is an experience that is harmful for me. And that's why, when these 4 different ways the boundaries get violated for me it was very intellectual, because I needed that intellectual piece, the logical piece, because a lot of times I wouldn't even know on an emotional level. I couldn't trust my body. I couldn't, because I didn't have that awareness, but I knew on a logical perspective that this isn't right. This isn't something that makes sense to me and that feels like it's going to be honoring my human experience. And so I say that because we don't always know. But that's why, after we get out of a toxic relationship, it's so important that we make that time to reflect on what were some of the things that I wasn't able to see when I was in it. Was I putting my partner on a pedestal above myself? Or, when it comes to these kind of spiritual experiences, if you're working with a therapist or a coach, is that coach or therapist validating you? Just like you said, Ashley, because without that validation piece, you are being bypassed to some goal that's outside of where you are, which has nothing to do with healing at all.
I love this. It's so true. And I think people, they really get caught in, like violating boundary or not creating boundaries for themselves and not realizing like you're not like growth can be painful, but I think Brian, your partner, he told me on the episode on U-Turn saying like, it shouldn't be painful all the time, or like you shouldn't make the pain mean that that's growth for you. And I see a lot of people who are in relationships that are most of the time very painful, and they're not setting that boundary of like, oh wow, this isn't how I want to grow or how I have to grow. And they're bypassing it by believing that growth is so much more powerful, but because it's painful.
Totally. Well, like you said, like in the self-development community, growth is such another buzzword. Well, I'm doing this because I'm growing, or I'm doing this because it's stretching me. But where the hell is the stretching ever going to end? At what point, because again, if we push ourselves too far outside of our window of tolerance, we will shut down. So we're not even actually taking the nutrients of that healing. Where we actually do grow is to do a little bit outside our comfort zone at a time, a little bit more, and then stop and process that experience. And then maybe a little bit more, instead of doing a 5-day transformational experience where, of course, we feel the high of it, but then we come back feeling like, what the hell just happened here? Like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with myself now. It doesn't feel like it's actually, and again, I don't want to dismiss the Tony Robbins experience, and there's so many amazing experiences that are group oriented out there. But I also think it's essential that we have the boundaries component where people are respected and honored for having their limits.
Yeah.
You said something about like, well, what do you do if you have a commitment, but your body is saying you're shutting down? I had a couple weeks ago, I had a session with a client, and I've been very honest with my clients. I struggle with PTSD. It's something that I've dealt with for a very long time. And, I sometimes have to cancel sessions even like 5-10 minutes before, because I'll have a trauma outburst. And so I let them know ahead of time that this is something I struggle with, but I also make sure to incorporate it in our sessions. How did it feel for you when I, had to cancel like that? Yes, you've been very compassionate and sensitive about the fact that I have this trauma, but let's process what it brought up in you, so then we can create a repair, so then they also feel acknowledged and validated for how, just because I have limitations doesn't mean my limitations don't affect people. And I think that's maybe what you were kind of talking about. Like, you can't just cancel and just act like it's no big deal. You still have obligations to people and a sense of responsibility for caring about our relationships with others.
Well, definitely. And I think PTSD, that is something that is, like diagnosed and something that you're processing. What I'm seeing more is a lot of people who, like, if they feel like, oh, I'm not in the mood for this today, I need to honor myself, and then they don't show up for commitments. And really the ultimate issue is that they're not reflecting on their yes before they say yes, and make sure that it's not a no. And of course, we're all human. So there's space for the truth that, there's a certain percent of the time where maybe somebody said they could do something and their body, they don't feel well, or they're tired, or they're overworked and they're not game for it. And that I understand. I think that that's just life. But I'm noticing that right now, in the spiritual space and personal development, a lot of people are like, I'm honoring my body, and that means that I'm not going to come. And it's becoming more often than not, like more often than not, they're not showing up, and I'm not hearing them say like, I suffer from, like PTSD or whatever it is. But yeah, this is really interesting. And when it comes to spiritual boundaries, can you give everybody listening like a couple ideas of like things that somebody might say to them that feels to you like a spiritual boundary is being crossed? Like you were saying, God wants you to do this, or what other boundaries would that be?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge what you just shared, because I totally get what you're saying, and also how important it is to be able to explain to our partners, to who we're in relationships with, about what's going on. That's where it's like, no is a full sentence. It's not always enough. Like, we can have our boundaries, but with our close people, it's important to fill them in about what's happening, just so we can create that, again, the repair in the relationship. So I want to validate you, Ashley, is what I'm trying to do.
I am down for some validation all the time. I was validating my parking last night at a dinner, and I handed him the thing. He's like, do you need validation? I'm like, I need validation all the time.
Absolutely. And I love, it's so good that you know that, and I love hearing you own that, because it's so important that we claim those needs. And it's so important.
Hey U-Turners, so sorry for the quick interruption, but I want to make sure you know that this episode has been brought to you by the Job Offer Academy, our e-course to help you land a new job you love. So if you're sick of applying for jobs and never hearing back, and you'd like to try a free version of our job hunting course, just head on over to youturnpodcast.com/job offer. That's youturnpodcast.com/job offer. Now let's get back to this week's episode. Well, so I'm curious, like, speaking of, like, I know that, we can use God and stuff like that. But I think I hear a lot of people saying, like, we're meant to go through this. Or somebody will say, like I had a friend once who had a boyfriend who said he was psychic, and he would use that to say, like, I'm getting a psychic read that we should do this. And that felt to me like a spiritual crossing. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but there's so many different ways it shows up that I wanted to show the variety to everybody listening.
Absolutely. That I agree with you. I think that is a spiritual bypass. I think it's one thing to say, I'm having an intuitive experience that feels like this is really powerful for me. What do you think about it? Let's sit with it. Let's both kind of, decide if this feels right for both of us, including the other person. I mean, I've met so many people in the spiritual community where they'll literally look at me and be like, I have this feedback for you, or I have, I'm getting this, and they'll just give me feedback, and I feel so violated, because first of all, they didn't ask me for permission, and third of all, I don't want it. Like, there's no part of me that's asking for that. And anytime we're presumptuous or assuming that we know better for another person's life, we are violating their boundaries. Absolutely.
Their spiritual boundary, you would say.
And intellectual. I think that's where the spiritual and intellectual can kind of go hand in hand, because we're not making room for their reality. We're taking over it. So we're almost like, because you're using the you use the intuition and the spiritual hit. So I think that kind of makes it more of a spiritual boundary, but it also invalidates oftentimes the other person's experience, especially if we're coming at it from a very arrogant and I know better perspective. You know what I mean?
And kind of going into intellectual boundaries, I would love to hear what that looks like, because I think the easy take on it that I would have is that's somebody that makes somebody feel like they know better than the other person. But I'm curious what else it can look like, intellectual boundaries.
Definitely. Perfect segue into the intellectual, right?
Yeah.
So I'll go back a little bit into how they get violated as kids. So our intellectual boundaries get violated as kids when we are not being validated for what is obviously going on. So let's say there's a major thing happening and we're kids, or let's say we have a drunk parent or a parent that's an addict, and they're in a state of distress, but nobody's talking about it. So as kids, we have this reality, we see what's happening, but because nobody's acknowledging it or helping us make sense of it, we start to then doubt our own reality as we grow. And we don't trust our perceptions, or even if we did have ideas or experiences as kids, or our parents tried to minimize it or try to act like, oh, it's not a big deal, so again, it starts to diminish our self-trust and ability to, we don't feel safe to really own and take on that confidence of owning our own choices and our own creativity. So that minimizing piece, the not talking about what is obviously going on. And also, let's say you had a parent that was a hardcore Republican or a hardcore Democrat, and all the kids had to, take on the same thinking as the one parent that's in charge. And what happens to us as we grow is that we start to take on the leader in the group. We don't start to make decisions for ourselves or learn to think for ourselves. We give our power away to somebody, whether that's, we go to a lot of these coaching experience, and we don't, we don't really think for ourselves. We just take on what they're saying as the ultimate truth. And I mean, just imagining how damaging that is, because then we are constantly violating our own boundaries and never really getting to know and getting in touch with what's really important for us.
And I feel like intellectual boundaries, like being put down, I think, for your intelligence, can it look like somebody saying well, you wouldn't know this because this reason, or is that an emotional boundary? Do you know what I mean?
Tell me a little more. Can you explain it a little more?
Yeah. Actually? So for example, I think of the marriages that are really unhappy, and there's resentment, and the husband will say to the wife, or the wife will say to the husband, well, you wouldn't know because you don't have this experience and I do. So somebody kind of positioning themselves as I'm the one that knows better.
Yes.
And you don't know.
An intellectual boundary. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's also emotional, right? Because it's putting down the person's ability to know for themselves. I don't know.
Yes, well, it's contempt. It's one of the Gottman's form of defenses that we use anytime we make ourselves, like you said, position ourselves higher than or power over, but in a way that's really putting our partner down. That's the most poisonous thing we can do in a relationship. So it definitely violates their perception boundary, which is the intellectual piece, but it's so criticizing that it actually bypasses a lot of our defenses. Contempt is probably it's the number one relationship killer, and there's no hope. If we stay in that place, our partner can't possibly win, because until there's that balance of power dynamic, there's no relating on a kind, and there's no open space for relating in a healthy way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I don't know, I was thinking about how you were sharing some parents didn't provide context.
Yes.
So their kids saw something and maybe the parent didn't share enough where they could create that sense of healing. I'm guessing there's an emotional, boundary crossed there. A kid didn't get the information they needed to sit with an experience, but is that also an intellectual boundary? I want just to understand a little bit more, in the context of my upbringing, where was my intellectual boundary violated? Because this is not something I've typically thought about.
The intellectual one is the one that most people are most surprised by, and it's the one that most people didn't even know it existed. Because again, we tend to understand the spiritual one a little more, or the physical one is more obvious, and the emotional one is a little more obvious. But the intellectual one is our perception. And so, let's say even the kids got the parents got divorced, but nobody talked about it. Nobody actually sat the kids down and explained to them what was happening in child language. It doesn't have to be the details. We don't have, the kids don't need to know, and they shouldn't know all the things that happen, especially if they're really intense. But the parents' role is to explain and to guide them, to help them if they have questions, and to help validate the reality, whether or not that means, I'm confused on which parent I want to stay at, or I feel really, all these experiences and thoughts that they're having someone sit with them and validate them. Otherwise, it just kind of gets like locked and stuck inside of themselves, and they don't know what to do with it.
You know what this makes me think of is I think almost every kid has had some experience of walking in on their parents having a sexual encounter, or seeing something like that in school, something that just feels sexually confusing for them. Would you say that that's an intellectual boundary because maybe they don't know what's going on? I remember walking in on something kind of sexual when I was a kid and being really scared and nobody explaining to me what was happening.
Definitely. I think sexuality is one that, most parents really struggle with, helping their kids, helping to know how to have that talk. But I think anytime there's masturbation involved or any kind of sexual act that's really obvious, it definitely, is an important opportunity to sit down with kids and explain what is happening. Because like you said, it's otherwise we don't know we don't know what's happening. And it can be very scary and uncomfortable. What are my parents doing? And it's different for every child, but what matters is the child's experience. What matters is what felt violating and not addressed and not dealt with for them. Something that happened for me is going to be very different than something that happened for you. And so, whenever I talk about these with my clients, they have flashes of certain things that pop up for them. And I always say, that's what's valid. That's what's important. And that's the thing that is wanting to come to surface and be processed because it probably wasn't acknowledged or validated and broken down to help you make sense in a way that you needed it back then.
Makes sense to me. Yeah. I just felt like such a typical thing. I think every kid has had an experience of seeing some sort of sexual event happening and maybe not being able to piece it together until they had sex ed, in fifth grade or whatever it was, in the States. But speaking of sex, physical boundaries, this feels like the most obvious, but I'm guessing there's some insidious things about it that are not so obvious. So I'm curious to kind of hear from you what that might look like for everybody listening.
Well, you're right in the sense of, physical is the most obvious, but where I think parents don't really get how it starts to show up as young kids is, again, if you have kids that don't necessarily like to be touched and they're constantly being forced to embrace family members or people to be physically affectionate with them, as young kids. And I remember even for me when I was young, I would get really uncomfortable and I just would feel like it was even people that I love. But again, when it's not done in a way that's sensitive to the child, it can feel very disruptive. And so when we start to shut down our inner mechanisms of being able to say no or to even be present to what's happening in our body, it can create enormous shame. Of course, it can happen if there's a sexual advance that is absolutely inappropriate and not asked for, and it can also happen with neglect. If we have a deprivation of physical touch, we can grow up as very needy, very greedy for affection, and put ourselves in situations where we embrace love from people that are absolutely toxic and horrible for us. So when we kind of start to break down, okay, where were my physical boundaries abused or were they neglected, and start to make sense and connect those dots and make sense of our story, we start to make new choices so we can be more mindful of where our come from is.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's making me think about that weird tipping point moment when you're a kid and suddenly it's not cool for your mom or your dad to see you naked kind of a thing.
Totally. Absolutely.
And I just looking back, I think that this was one that my parents did a pretty good job. I remember me telling my mom, I don't want him to see anymore. She's like, okay, that sounds good, and that was never an issue again. But I think that it's also some kids have the naked parent where the dad or whatever just walks around naked and doesn't even care. And I'm guessing that is a huge, would you say that's a physical boundary since it's not their body that's being exposed, more of a spiritual boundary, an emotional boundary? How would you kind of look at that one?
So I don't have an answer to that, actually. I don't know, because it's usually the physical boundaries are more touch or lack of touch oriented. And I think with those kind of things, it's so, so much of it is how our parents put things into context. If we grow up in a village in another part of the world where nakedness is very normalized and part of the routine, it's probably not going to be an issue at all. But growing up here where you see all your friends and like my friend's daddy or mommy doesn't do that. So I think it's helping them to make sense of things is really key. But
interesting.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer for that one.
Yeah, no, me neither. I mean, I'm literally just thinking about like all of the weird things that I've heard growing up as a kid right now. And what is your take? Like, do people typically have one that they feel like kind of was super violated in their childhood? Or do you think all four of these really work in unison most of the time and it's not that one really leads for people?
I usually find that there's one that leads. And the rest are, at different stages of our life. They can come up at different things as they become violated if we're in a bad relationship with someone. But what happens is we're more aware if we don't have a violation of emotional boundaries, if somebody violates that boundary as an adult, we'll be more aware of it. We're like, hey, you just invalidated my feelings. Don't do that. Or this is what I need from you to heal that. But if we've been violated, we won't even recognize to stand up for ourselves. So that's where, it gets really interesting. So I would say most of the time, again, if it's like a, really severe, like a rape or something really intense, of course, that's like a physical, emotional, intellectual, all those things can be intertwined. But what I like to suggest to people I work with is, pay attention to what is the thing that you end up feeling most resentful or angry about in your relationships. Like I know for me, with my partner, his emotional stuff is not a big deal. But when I cross into his lane and I actually invalidate his perception, that is a no-no. And I've done it many times in the beginning of our relationship. And I had to be really firm with myself to not do that because his intellectual boundaries have been, violated. And it's so important for me to help him heal that and to be a part of the healing. So I want to say we all violate each other's boundaries. And I want to really own that. We all have the capacity to do this. Of course, ideally we're on the one side of the spectrum where we're not doing it on any kind of severe level, but we have to be vigilant with ourselves to be aware of believing our partner, when they're, or relationships or friendships or whoever's coming to us, whether that's we're, texting them too much or, asking them to make time for us in ways that just doesn't work for them. We have to honor their limits and be able to vocalize that we respect their boundaries, even if it feels really unfamiliar for us and it's not our boundary that's important.
So good. Gosh, there's so much here for everyone. And you know what it's making me think a lot about is like, for example, with dating, there have been some times where the person doesn't feel like they've crossed an emotional, spiritual, intellectual, or physical boundary, but I don't feel safe around them. And I realize in reflecting on it that maybe there was a way that they were talking about someone else that, if that person was there, that's a huge cross to their emotional boundary, like the way that they're putting down their experience, or maybe it's a cross of their intellectual boundary, the way that they're putting down what they know, their intelligence.
Absolutely. And that feels so icky for someone to be speaking of someone in that kind of way. Of course, I could understand why that would feel really uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I remember one guy in particular I dated, I used to always come home and say for some reason, I don't feel like I can share with him. And I realize now it's because the way he spoke about other people, it felt like, well, I don't feel safe to share with you anything. Because if you're going to talk about that person's intellect, why wouldn't you talk about mine that way as well?
Absolutely.
Beautiful. What a beautiful conversation. Obviously everybody's going to want to find you guys. She posts such great stuff on Instagram. I am always looking at the things that you're posting. You post such good graphics to compare situations. So tell everybody, where can they find you?
Thank you, Ashley, for your lovely words. Yes, so Instagram is my main platform. I post relationship-oriented content daily. So it's @Silvy Khoucasian. I probably don't want to spell it here because it's a long one. But
do it.
It says SilvyKhoucasian. And me and my partner also created a boundaries program in specific to help with all these things that we've been talking about, but also we created lots of scripts to help you with language on how to actually own your boundaries and how to have consequences if people aren't honoring your boundaries and all that good stuff.
Oh, so helpful. Thank you again for making the time to be here. It's such a great conversation.
So welcome, Ashley. I'm so honored to be here.
Hey guys, it's Ash here, just reflecting on the episode with Silvy, and I just thought it was really powerful for her to be able to draw these 4 boxes of different boundaries that we get violated when we're kids and throughout our life. And I heard a quote recently, and I don't know where it came from, but somebody said to me in a conversation, they said they think grief is just love that doesn't really know where to go. And I think that when our boundaries get crossed as kids, because maybe we don't know how to communicate, maybe we don't know what we need. And a lot of the times we figure out what we need through context. We find out what we need because we didn't get it. There's so many times where I'm trying to figure out what someone's core values are. And in personal development, we're told that if we feel uneasy or our nervous system is not being regulated or we just feel out of whack, that's usually an opportunity for us to look at ourselves and grow and question, whether there's an area or a belief that we're buying into. So, in personal development, we're so encouraged to turn back to ourselves. But what I'm learning is that sometimes when we don't get what we want or when we feel triggered or dysregulated, what it really is about is that a core value that we hold very high isn't being met, or that something inside of us is being crossed. And it's through that context of feeling dysregulated or off that we're able to realize that maybe we have a need, or maybe something that we hold as very sacred has been violated. For example, maybe you had a tiff with somebody and you realize after you look at that tiff that the reason that you were so upset is because you felt like your security was violated, or your freedom was violated, or your value for balance was violated, or your spirituality was violated. A lot of the times when we feel unrest with someone, it's an opportunity to look at ourselves and see where we contributed to that. But there's also a lot of times where it's just feedback that we have a core value that isn't working. And that exists also in the workforce. Maybe you feel really upset about something at work, and maybe you're going into a story that it's you that had caused that thing. But maybe the reason you're upset is because you actually have a core value that's so important to you that's been crossed. And if you can really ask yourself, what is this really about? You can find that nugget. And if you don't know what your core values are, I have a core values guide at youturnpodcast.com/core values. And that's YOUTURN podcast.com/core values. Full disclosure, I think my brother and I set up some sort of email sequence, like offering you some sort of training or guide. Everything we have is great, but sorry in advance if you don't want that stuff, but at least you can get the core values guide. But honestly, I just think that knowing your core values are such a key ingredient for your career and your life. And a lot of the times when we feel our boundaries are crossed, it's really that a core value has been crossed. And so it's such an opportunity when you feel unregulated to ask these bigger questions to yourself. And like I said, I'd have a conversation recently with somebody, and the words that they said to me was that grief is just love that doesn't know where to go. And, when you really think about that, it's like, whenever our boundaries are crossed, we have so much grief. And I think that when you really can look at that grief or look at that anxiety that you feel, it's such an opportunity to love yourself and give that grief a home and meet it with love. And, I know that I'm rambling, but I just have so much emotionally that I feel after this episode, thinking about boundaries. And I just was in the Middle East a couple months ago on a group trip, and all these people on the trip really opened up and really went deep and really shared and were vulnerable with each other. And one woman said to me, on the last day of the trip, she feels her armor coming back on so that she can go back into the world. And that so deeply sat with me. And I just got into the question of why do we put our armor back on? What is it about our environment, about our world, about what reality we're co-creating that moves us to put armor on? Like, what is it about that situation that we're in life that makes us feel like we can't keep our guard down and stay vulnerable? So if you're in a reality right now where you feel yourself putting armor on, maybe it's when you go to your family's house, maybe it's when you see a certain friend. And also, alternatively, you notice when you see other friends, you don't put your armor on. You feel like you're very vulnerable, your guard is down. My invitation is to start to pay attention to what is it that you're believing about the situation, or what is it about your history with that person or that family unit that makes you want to put your protection, put your emotional armor on before you walk through the door? Has a boundary been crossed? Has a boundary been violated for you? And what does that tell you about your core values? And again, if you're stuck in a cul-de-sac with this, head on over to uturnpodcast.com/core values. We have a great list and guide for you to be able to figure out what your core values are. And as per usual, thank you so much for giving me a review here on the U-Turn Podcast. It's so powerful for me to be able to grow, for sharing it on Instagram, for DMing me. All of these things mean so much. I just can't thank you enough. And that is just me here signing off. Thanking you so much. Sending you a lot of love. Thanks again for tuning into this week's episode of the U-Turn Podcast. We keep really detailed show notes at uturnpodcast.com. So if our guest mentioned a book or a resource that you're interested in, you'll be able to find that there. In the meantime, if you were inspired by this episode, if it made an impact in your life, we would be so grateful if you subscribed and posted a review for us on iTunes. Rumor has it on the street, the more reviews we get, the more subscribes we get, the more we can grow and get our impact out there in the world. In the meantime, I'd love to hear from you at Ashley Stahl on Instagram. I'm so grateful for connecting, and I look forward to next week's episode.